Okay, so I'm Andrew Rubinger from Boston Middleware. I'm here back with Adam Koblentz of Zero Turnaround. Today we're here at the Java Meetup, and we've been talking about a bunch of tools that we can use to make development of enterprise Java hopefully a lot easier and faster. We've gone over the GeekSeek examples from the book Continuous Enterprise Development in Java by O'Reilly, written by me and my buddy Aslak Knudsen in Oslo. So I think today we're going to go and now take a look at the example application and see what that's all about. Here we have a fresh instance of JBoss EAP 6. So what we're going to do is just kind of fire this up in its full mode and deploy the application. The full application is available right here. And
this projector is a little bit dimmer.
Yeah, this one's a little bit dimmer.
Yeah.
Still see me all right? Yeah.
Yes.
Not so anymore. Okay. So here we have the GeekSeek application. As we said, this is kind of like a very slimmed down clone of Lanyard, but it does a couple neat things like we log in via Twitter credentials. So what I'm going to do here is I'll say log in, and then it uses OAuth, and it pops up this little like, hey, do you want to let this application log in as you? And yeah, now you guys can all see my username and password as I sign in to Twitter, which will then send a token back to the GeekSeek application and say, hey, cool. So if you want to know how to do OAuth with Twitter, we have one way as an example in the book, and here we are. And what we can do is we can go through and do things like add conferences. Like, for instance, today we're here at the Boston Java Meetup. We're meeting up in 90 degrees. It's warm. And this will have a start date of today, like this time. And we're going to end, I don't know, say we'll just stay here in the heat until sometime in the middle of October, and we'll add the conference, and there we are. We've added a conference, okay? So we're not going to go through the whole app, but this is basically the application that we've gone through in the book, and all the use cases that are in there in some way tie back to this thing, which, again, you can like download and run and actually get into and click around and see how things work. Our user interface tests work on this. Our RESTful tests, which test the HTTP endpoints that are built in a RESTful HADOS fashion, are in there. The example we saw earlier today about the sending of the email, that's tested in here. So what we're going to do, now that we've like tested this application, I think it's pretty cool for us to go and actually take a look at what this application is doing. And Zero Turnaround has released this new product called XRebel, which Adam will come up to explain for us. And XRebel is ultra cool because it acts as a Java agent. So you're giving it all sorts of ghostly powers by nature of registering this Java agent at runtime, right? But when I click in here, now that I've booted this up with XRebel, you see that I have this neat little widget down at the bottom. And when I click on this guy, it gives me some context regarding SQL queries, stuff that's in the session, exceptions that were thrown, and then there's like some settings and stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll configure this to filter out, well, we'll see the whole thing first. First I'll log in again, and because I've already authorized myself, it now clicks in, and here I am, and I'm authorized, and I'm in. And it shows me that I've now executed 7 SQL queries, and it's showing me like the full boat of stuff that's actually going through in the runtime. So we'll go through and we'll configure.
Can you make it a little bigger?
Yeah, I can make it bigger. How can I make it bigger?
Shift Command Plus.
What is it?
Shift Command Plus.
Shift Command Plus. How's that? A little better? Cool. This particular package is under org Continuous Enterprise Development in Java. So I'll just kind of save that. And now when I go and I clear through now, we see that my call stack is kind of limited to the stuff that I've set in my filter. So I'm only seeing my stuff. And we'll see here that like through the register user call and the OAuth authenticator, eventually we get this insert into user, and we have a select into user. We see all the calls and like queries that were executed, and the URLs that were part of executing that whole call stack 2. We also have a bunch of stuff. These are all the stuff that's in the session data. So at runtime, you can kind of see what's in there. Probably a little bit more appropriate for me to introduce and for you to call up Adam to come and tell us about XRebel and give us a little bit of a tour. So we can warm welcome for our buddies.
Hey everybody, so my name is Adam Koblentz. I'm the product marketing manager at Zero Turnaround. So this is actually my second time being at the Boston Java Meetup in a speaking fashion. Previously I came here with our CEO, Evgeny Kavanov, talking about our continuous delivery tool. So one of the things I kind of want to talk about is, we're talking about enterprise Java today, talking about Java EE and how hard it is to test it. So one of the things that I did before I joined Zero Turnaround was I actually worked as a back-end framework developer for a large investment bank. And that meant writing lots and lots of Java EE that was incredibly legacy, and all the hassles that involved in that you guys lived through, that Andrew lived through. He actually took the initiative to write his own framework to deal with the testing. I just quit and did something else. So one thing that I remember having to do explicitly that I wish I had Archillion for was I had to write a framework on top of Spring that was also interchangeable with Java EE, so that people could write their code using either of them interchangeably with my framework, whatever kind of components they wanted to use. And that means that I had to support even the incredibly esoteric app server specific stuff that only WebSphere and WebLogic supported, and half of it was written on Spring. So that means that I had to be able to write test cases that would work with message-driven beans, and also write stuff that normal Spring POJOs would deal with. So my life was terrible for a long time dealing with this stuff, right? Couple that with the fact that my test suite took 6 days to run because it had 35 components. And each component, because basically I had to have at least one component for every component of Spring, plus extras that handled the extra Java EE stuff. So if I wanted to do a full release of my software, it took me over a day to actually even put a new zip file of jars onto my own website internally. This kind of led me to go into some conferences, trying to learn how to optimize things, figure out what I could do, because I was dealing with 15-year-old Java at this point, right? This was as soon as Java existed, as soon as Oak became Java and people started actually using this in the real world. The bank that I worked at actually started using it for their own stuff too, and they basically started migrating their C and C++ frameworks into Java, just straight porting them with the same APIs and everything along the way, and that led to this amalgamation of nonsense that I had to work on day in and day out. So at a conference, I met Evgeny, who's the CEO and founder of Zero Turnaround, and I learned about JRebel. And what I learned in this made me realize that I had possibly the worst Java enterprise job that one could have from a build and productivity standpoint. So this is funny now, right? Now that I don't do this anymore, but if we think about what my life was like, you should all feel bad for me and pity me, and I want your blessings. But basically, what happened was I was given the opportunity to join Zero Turnaround, and I've never been happier, right? Because I now have the opportunity to solve the problems that I had for you guys and make your lives way better without you having to do a whole lot, right? I'm not asking you to change frameworks. I'm not asking you to change apps. I'm not asking you to change tech stacks or culture in your company. I'm asking you just to add a Java agent to your JVM options. I think that's pretty reasonable. So basically, what I'm here to talk about today is I have two things. Let's see how this works with this crazy resolution. I should try playing this. All right, so here's me. This is actually a picture that one of my friends who's an amazing photographer, only takes pictures of me when we're at bars. I don't know why. So every picture of me on Facebook or pictures I have from conferences are all iPhone quality camera pictures, so they're all terrible. But he brings out his $10,000 set of lenses and SLRs and stuff to bars. So every good picture of me is me with a drink in my hand. So this is the one that I'm just going to stick with for a while because it looks interesting. This was taken at Cafe Luna, I believe it's called, in Salem. It's like the Czech bar in Salem. It's a cool place. I used to be a software engineer. I was a senior software engineer at a bank. I left the bank to go work at Zero Turnaround. I started the pre-sales team there, trained up all the other pre-sales engineers, developed all the demos and all that kind of stuff. And now I'm in marketing because I realized how much I hated marketing, and I wanted to fix that by making good marketing that people actually want to look at because we have good stuff that's worth talking about. So what Zero Turnaround does is we basically provide revolutionary tools to help you develop higher quality software faster. And what it gives us our JRebel, which is our 7-year-old product. 7 years old as of last week, actually. That's the anniversary of the first version, which had a different name, different code base, completely different functionality, features, and everything. So it's 7 years old. And XRebel, which is, I think, 2.5 months old now. So this is the first time anyone is speaking in public about XRebel that is not in Estonia, which is where our company is based. So far we've only had one webinar thing about this, where we actually have our own conference in Estonia, and Yevgeny gave a talk about this. This is the first time anyone's ever. This is the first recording of anyone talking about this in the U.S. And it's awesome because we actually have seen so much adoption with XRebel. People want to use that and trade in licenses for JRebel because it's so cool. So the point of XRebel is we want to commit better code. And I'll kind of talk more about what that really means. But JRebel, change code instantly. We have support for all the major IDEs, all the major app servers. That includes the entire JBoss suite, so AS, Wildfly, and EAP. And we support really old versions of things all the way up to the latest ones. So if you're on like the bleeding edge of Tommy, for example, we support it. That's not a problem. Frameworks, we have support for over 85 frameworks. But that means that you can not only make code changes to your normal Java code, but also your framework integrations. So if, say you want to change your Spring config, that's not a problem for us. Make the change, hit refresh in your browser, and you'll see the code change. And I'll show you this working, too. We've been issued for over 85. XRebel is X-ray glasses for your web app. What that means is that it gives you the ability from the most junior developer to the most senior JVM tuning architect guy, right, to understand the performance of your application, improve the quality of your application, and reduce rework. Because the number of times I and other people I know have written code that passed all our tests, went to QA signed off on it, goes to production, and you find there's some performance bug that only shows up under like intense load, or you find that there's some latency issue that only shows on a database, right? That's actually not part of your machine or not part of your data center, right? Then it comes back to you, and you're like, crap, what are we gonna do with this, right? So then your company's paying for that rework. You're spending your time reworking on something that you already thought was done, and so we want to help reduce that. So with XRebel, you can find and fix session bloat. So whether you have incredibly fast-growing deltas in your session, or you have memory leaks in your session, we can find that. Rogue SQL, like you have incredibly inefficient queries, like you have n+1 queries, or you have inefficient ORM configuration, like your Hibernate is configured poorly, that kind of stuff. And also hidden exceptions. So every single enterprise application I've ever seen, there are exceptions, and everyone just says, oh, we know why those happen, so we're going to ignore those now. Until you don't know why that happened, you think you did, and then you corrupted your production database. We actually just published some case studies today where that actually was the case. One of our customers, who's a Fortune 500 company, they only have like 10 Java devs in the whole company. They had these legacy applications, and they said, we have these exceptions, we know why they happen, we're not really worried about it. So then they launched XRebel, and within a week, they figured out that those exceptions were actually because of a critical misunderstanding and miscommunication between the API they and a business partner were using, and what the collisions meant when they both had differing data and how to merge it. And what we actually saved them from with XRebel was we saved them from having their production and their vendors' production with different data sets for the products, basically. And it would have been a huge problem on their end if this had actually gone live and actually been triggered. Because if, say if someone on the vendor side had changed the product and they hadn't changed it on their end, they wouldn't have had a proper merge, which would have just broken everything. They would have gotten screwed up databases. So this is the kind of thing, like, I know I'm guilty of this too. Like, the apps I wrote in production definitely have exceptions. I think I know why they happen. But the guy who knows why they really happened quit 5 years ago or somewhere else in the company, it's not Java anymore, that kind of stuff, right? So now I want to give you a quick demo of these things. I'm using the Spring Pet Clinic app for this. And the reason I'm using the Spring Pet Clinic app instead of like a full like Java EE app is because I'm using the most commonly followed application in the world when it comes to how to do things, right? This is Spring's example of how to write Spring apps. If their own example is this screwed up, how great can everyone else's code be, right? So I'm just going to close this, and I'm going to stop this because I want to actually launch this differently. So this is just me using Eclipse, and it's running I'm running a local Tomcat, and I'm going to run this with my special XRebel Tomcat. It's going to start up. I'm going to hit refresh, and we're going to see what I can do with this, right? So first off, with JRebel enabled, I can make code changes. So I can actually use XRebel to find the problems in my code, and then you can use JRebel to fix them without having to actually do a build and refresh, recompile cycle. So hit refresh. Okay, my app's up and running. I have XRebel right here. It's letting me know that it's up. Okay, so let's just say I want to start by making a really simple code change. Okay, so I'll go back to my Eclipse. I'm just going to change this first page. So here, this is just a JSP change, right? I'll change some text. You know, we can all make JSP changes anyways, usually. Change a property file. Hit save. Now, go back to my browser, hit refresh. And we see that we have our changes, right? So the JSP code change worked. What we actually did is we don't move the files on the disk. We actually remapped the app server to look for your source tree. So all your static content is pulled directly out of your source tree from now on, instead of having to copy files on disk and deal with overwriting the files inside of the deployments directory. Then we see that the messages.properties was getting reread, and we actually pick that up. And if you look inside the console, we see that the messages.properties got reloaded by JRebel. It's kind of hard to see probably because it's still small console text, but we reload the bundled file inside of the WAR file without having to rebuild anything or move on the app server. Now, those are both simple, but let's talk about doing a pretty common everyday, Java dev change, right? So we're going to do some form validation work, okay? So personally, on one of the apps I had to deal with, whenever I do with form validation, I still had to build the whole app because we had a validation component that had to get injected into the application, and it was, a really complicated enterprise thing, right? So here I hit submit. All these fields are required. Okay, that's not a problem. I'll go back to my Eclipse. I go to the validator that we're using for this form.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah, I'm going to try to do that. It's a good idea.
Type fonts
Got it.
in the search. Yeah.
I want this one. Yeah.
Oh, it's the last one.
Is it? That was text editor. Okay. There we go. Cool. So in this validator, we see that we have a bunch of string utils, and then it's going to reject the value if it doesn't exist or whatever, right? So I'm going to take this first name check. I'm just going to comment it out. Okay? So now this is a method body change, right? This is the kind of change that if you have a debugger hooked up and your ID is set up correctly with your JVM and your app server, you can make this kind of change. Okay? So I'll show you that. Sure, that's fine. Yep. I'm going to resubmit the form. Okay, that's fine. Okay? But we actually didn't leverage that. We actually reloaded the class ourselves, right? And the reason that we did that is because we actually are so much better than JVM Hotswap that we don't want to risk Hotswap getting involved and screwing up any of our stuff. So what we're going to do now is much more complicated. I'm going to actually refactor the class and create a new method by cleaning up our code a little bit and restructuring it. So let's say, for example, I had a code review. My boss told me, look, Adam, I love that this works, but I hate that you have one giant method, and that one method is controlling the entire validation for your form. How about we clean this up a little bit? Maybe you want to reuse parts of this validator somewhere else, okay? So that's fine. We're going to take the last name, address, and city checks, and we're just going to refactor them into a new method, okay? So I'm going to create a new fields method. Wow, that looks bad. Okay, so now I have a method call where they used to be, okay? Now we actually change the schema of the class. So here's that at the end of that method, and here's our new method, okay? So change the schema. And now just to prove that we're actually calling this new method, I'm actually going to change some of the other validation rules. So let's make last name optional, okay? And just for fun, let's do more than one change at a time, because that's not a problem for us. We're going to make last name use a new key. Go to message.properties, add our new key at the end. Okay, hit refresh. Sure. Okay, so we see that just hitting refresh, we have the last names there, right? It's optional, so the new method is being called. We also can see that the property file got changed again, and we have our new key for the address. So we were able to basically redefine the schema for the class in the JVM without having to do a redeploy or a restart, or even like a full build or anything. And if we look at what happened in the console, it's a little hard because it's a little too big, but we see that the class got reloaded for the validator, but that's not it. We actually know what's going on inside the JVM because we have access to the whole object dependency graph. We also have access to the classes on disk, and we can see what's running in the JVM. So we can tell what frameworks you're using without any configuration, and we can also tell what else has to be reloaded based on your changes. So here, the validator got reloaded. Then also the add owner form and edit owner form both have references to the validator, so they both got reloaded too. And also the framework integration kicks in. You see that we actually start reconfiguring some beans, because we can figure out that we're using Spring without you telling us anything. Like we can tell org.springframework.whatever is loaded in the JVM. Okay, let's check there. Okay, yes, there are beans defined for these things. Now we're gonna look at the code changes. Okay, let's wire them so that the new versions are actually the ones that are being used. And then at the end, just for fun, property file gets picked up again for that new key for the address. Okay, so this is really cool, and this allows you to basically, what we find is that this actually allows people to save about one full work month per year. So we do this huge study where we have like 2,000 to 3,000 people respond to our surveys every year. And we ask, what app server do you use? What frameworks do you use? How long does it take you to do a full build and compile time of your application? How long does it take you to actually do a deploy? How many times do you actually make changes every hour that you want to deploy, right? And what we find is that people are so afraid of doing redeploys that they actually just bundle their changes and just kind of hope that they can isolate out what went wrong after they make their changes. And that's terrible, right? And we also have other people who really adhere to making one change at a time, but they end up wasting half their time just kind of sitting there waiting for stuff to happen. I know that I personally spent a lot of time going to Starbucks across the street from my office. I also spent a lot of time talking to my friends who worked elsewhere in the building because I had the 16-minute redeploy on one of the things I wrote. So the time it took me to hit save in my IDE, do the Ant build, which was like 20,000 lines of Ant, and then come back and have a deployable WAR file took me about 16 minutes. And then actually restarting my app server and reinitializing the application took like 5 minutes minimum because I actually was doing some math on a database, and so I actually had to create a tree, like a TRIE tree, where I actually had to do mathematical probability and stuff on a set of data. So I really wasted about 21 minutes of my life every time I made a code change that I can't get back, right? And as I got, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Does this work with the static files, like the auto-publishing on the .NET server? If I have my JavaScript and HTML auto-publishing?
Yeah, so we actually disable auto-publishing and instead remap it to pull it out of your source tree. So whether you're doing JavaScript, HTML, CSS, your pictures or whatever, you can avoid publishing. And the coolest thing is this actually works on remote JVMs too. So let's say, for example, you have, let's say, for example, you're given a really weak laptop, but the company makes up for it by giving you a nice VM slice somewhere that's really powerful. We actually avoid you having to do the full transfer of the ear or WAR and then publish it again, because we actually use the browser, we use the IDE to piggyback on the servlet context and actually send the files over HTTP to the server and then have it do the hot patching locally from that server. And we have integration written for some cloud providers. We're working on OpenShift integration so you can get JBoss in the cloud. Yeah.
So is your software in the remote JVM also?
Yeah. So you just copy the jar file, add the Java agent, and that's it. And then the rest of the configuration is just installing the plugin into your IDE and giving it the fully qualified context path for your app. And then we send the files over. Now, what I want to show you is how this works with XRebel. So that was JRebel, right? That's our hot patching thing, which makes you more productive and less stressed out and overall happier as a coder. Now, XRebel is what kind of helps you identify what's wrong with your code when it's the easiest and cheapest to fix, right? Because telling you that the code that you wrote a second ago is inefficient is way better than telling you the code you wrote 6 months ago crashed in production, right? And what we want to kind of do is make it so that everyone can basically have a profiler, right? Like you want to think about like a profiler for the masses kind of thing, right? We don't want you to have to study to become like that JVM tuning expert to find what should be relatively easy things to figure out is wrong with your code. Now, before I get too far in this, I want to give you a couple of anecdotes, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. So, like, we did extensive testing and customer interviews during the beta process with XRebel. And one of the things that we did was we would go actually to people's offices, install XRebel on their apps, and say, hey, before we do anything, how many queries do you think are on this page? Right? And I'd be told, you know, we have a lot of data, 5, 10 queries. They're pulling in a lot of rows, but we're not like calling them that often, so it's not a big deal, right? And I was in an office maybe 3,000 feet from here tops when I had this conversation, and it ended up being that they had 120 queries on the page because somebody called a method that they didn't realize was actually doing database queries inside of a nested for loop. Because people don't realize where data is coming from. They assume it must already just be an object in memory somewhere, or clearly this is cached somewhere, right? It wasn't. They had 120 queries on an average page because they had these nested for loops that were just calling for data. Another one is also not far from here. We asked them, okay, so how many megs do you think your sessions are, right? I mean, how big are your sessions? And they're like, we don't use sessions. They just store login credentials just for authentication. I'm like, okay, cool, no problem. But then we found out they're actually using 45 meg sessions. They had 45 megs in a session because they were actually inadvertently injecting the entire Drools runtime into a session. And they hadn't had a problem yet because this app hadn't gone live yet, and it was still in QA, but in QA they only had 3 users. And so that's okay, fine, I have 120 megs in session data, but no one actually looks at that because the app works. So no one ever does a post-mortem on the QA to see what actually happened performance-wise, right? But we hook up XRebel, and in 3 seconds, the guy's beat red and embarrassed about the fact that like he didn't realize that somebody on his team injected the entire Drools runtime session scoped in his application. So what XRebel wants to do, it tries to do, like, it doesn't do anything new, right? If you sit down and you have JProfiler or an APM, and you have a dedicated performance person, they can spend the time and the cycles and figure the stuff out, okay? But who has time or resources to have that guy or girl on their team not writing code? If they're that good at the JVM stuff in the first place, they should be writing the stuff that you need them to write. So what we do with XRebel is we kind of show you that we tell you where things are going wrong because they're going really wrong. So this is the stock Spring Pet Clinic app. I've done nothing to make this more inefficient. This is what everyone who's learning how to use Spring uses as their template for how to write Spring code, right? And we see here that there's only like 10 rows on the screen. There's 10 rows of very basic data that should only be coming from one table. Why, or maybe 2 tops? Why do we have 237 milliseconds of queries to run? And why were there 37 queries in the first place? Well, with XRebel, we can actually go and find out. So we warn you first off that this is crazy if it's too many queries. We come with what we think are a pretty reasonable set of thresholds, and then you can actually modify the thresholds based on what is reasonable for your application. And if you keep hitting the thresholds too often, we'll warn you, maybe change your thresholds, because this isn't being effective anymore, because you're seeing this message on every page, right? So if we click on this, this looks terrible because it's so zoomed in, but the idea is that this is the first time that a profiler for a developer actually lets them see in the browser the full request to the database. And so we can track that me calling get on pet clinic owners required 37 queries, and this is the total running time. Then we show you that we had one select that returned 10 rows. This is a very reasonable query. This query gave us these are the owners. That's all we actually want on this page, right? But then why do we run 26 more queries? Or 36 more queries? Well, we see that simple JDBC clinic.load owners, pets, and visits is called. And that spawns 36 queries. And then we look and we see, okay, why are these 10 queries all grouped together? Because it's the exact same query with different parameters. This is a classic n+1. And this is what Spring out of the box tells you to do with a Spring app, right? So what this means is that we can now take that latency from the database and multiply it by the number of times that we're calling against the database, right? So what this page should have no more than 2 queries or one join, right? You can write the owners and have it join against the pets, pull the pets in for the owners, and you're done. One query. But because we're using JPA in this case, an unoptimized JPA, or an unoptimized JDBC, or an unoptimized Hibernate, we're just blindly pulling in everything, okay? And so we see that here that we ran these queries, okay? Then we did the same thing again. But these just got called, literally just calls the same query 10 times now, because it wants to know what types of pets there are. That's not changing, right? And then it calls and gets every visit again as well for every pet, right? So we can see here that these are all grouped together because they shouldn't be run anyways, and it helps you identify what you're doing. And we can tell what methods were called that actually made this happen. Then you can go into the queries view. And in the queries view, we actually show you like the full stack trace from JDBC in this case, but every single query that was run, how many rows were returned, what duration, and everything. Okay, so this is super useful for that kind of thing. But now let's talk about sessions, okay? It's not always obvious to you what's in your session. You may think you know, but you could very easily have something session scope that you shouldn't have. So let's say, for example, go pick on Betty Davis. Okay, so let's go add a visit. Okay, well, something just happened here. For some reason, we have 1.5 megs in our session. Okay, so our session grew. So first off, the delta is too large because we grew by way too much too fast, which makes us think that you're writing some code that might, be erratic and just run off and grow and grow and grow. We also see that it's just too large in general. Like your high watermark in your session is too high, right? This is limiting the number of users you have tremendously. Because if you have a 12 meg session and you have 100 users, that's a lot of data, right? It's not sustainable. So let's just click on that. And what we see is that we actually can turn the session into the object graph of the session. And so we can actually let you click in and see the data of what's inside your session. Okay, so this is this owner, see there's a servlet, but then we see the visit. We have a 1.6 meg visit. And then we go click into there and see that the pet actually has a cache. And this cache is 1.6 megs, right? Then, if I go back, and I want to go home, it's still there. So now we also know that we have a memory leak, right? Because now we have this visit object as a pet in our session. We're not using it anymore. It's not active on the screen. If we ever go to that page, we're not going to be editing the same pet again, right? So now we have this 1.5 meg black hole per user for everyone who goes to that screen, right? So what we want to do is we want to show you that and make that obvious to you, so that you don't get a situation where you accidentally session scope a controller or something and pull in 15 megs worth of Spring libraries that don't belong into your session. The last one, I actually am going to modify the app a little bit because luckily Spring doesn't actually give you any real runtime exceptions in the app. But with JRebel, I can actually make some code changes that introduce an error without having to rebuild the app again. So I now have a runtime exception in my validator, and I can now go and add an owner. See, it's still telling me my session's too large. If I keep doing this, it's going to warn me that, like, okay, your session's still too large. Maybe you should, configure your thresholds because we're still warning you. Yeah.
Can you tune that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this little sprocket here, packages, thresholds, right there. So you can change whether you care about certain things or not. You can also change the numbers. So if you don't care about sessions as long as they're under a meg, make that your threshold. By default, we ship with 500, 200, 10, and 100. We think that 500K for a session is pretty reasonable. You know, if you're actually doing session-based work, that's okay. But if your session is increasing by over 200K per request, then we'll warn you about that. If the number of queries executed is more than 10 per request, we'll warn you about that as well. These are just things that we think are reasonable, but you know, obviously your app's different than ours, so go change them, right? So now, when I try to validate, now we get an exception because I have that new runtime exception. So normally, Java devs might not even know the exception happened because the app didn't crash, right? We have a new runtime exception, it's not being handled, but no one really cares because the app's still going. If I actually click on this, what we do is we actually invert the stack trace so you can see where your exception is actually coming from. So you're not stuck trying to find, oh, well, I have this null pointer, but I don't really know what's happening because this is like 15 layers deep in the framework. What we have is owner validator.validate on line 20 through this exception. So now I can go back to my IDE and say, okay, line 20, here's my exception. I got it. I understand what I'm doing now. Okay? And this is really important because I know that anyone here who writes actual applications that are used by real companies probably have tons of layers of stuff between your presentation layer and where exceptions could happen. You have to try to figure out where they are. If we can tell you in a very quick, reasonable fashion exactly what line number threw the exception, then you have a much better chance of figuring out what actually went wrong in your application. So, for example, this case study that went live today, they thought it was happening in one other place because part of their exception handling was just catching it and throwing it back and saying this is where it happened. But that wasn't what was happening. It wasn't that. It was actually at the processing layer in the merge conflict. So that's really like XRebel and JRebel got together combined, helping you write better code faster, right? So it's all about making your job easier and your deliverables higher quality. And with that, back to my keynote, I actually made this meme like 2 years ago for the sales team of my company, like based on Taken, right? Like they all loved it, so I just include it once in a while. So that's everything I've got for you. But there are 2 links here. I tried to use a shortener. We have our own little shortener, 0t.ee. So the important things are jr.bjm and xr.bjm. And those give you 14-day trials on both of our products. And I'm sure that Burke is awesome and would somehow let me email those to you if you RSVPs actually came up or something. Yeah, and that's what it is. That's what I got. Any questions? Go for it.
So